All right. Welcome to Module 3, Week 5, the importance of community participation in development processes. Now, I won't be completely using lots and lots of tourism examples, but know that everything we talk about here applies to community development related to tourism development. So let's get going here. Now, community participation in development oftentimes expressed in a moral or ethical way. It's the right thing to do, right? And indeed, it is the right thing to do. But in fact, it's also for protected area heritage managers, a very practical thing to do. Now, as you might remember, in an earlier moment, I cited the esteemed Professor Emeritus Steve McCool of the University of Montana, when he had mentioned that time ago, managers have the mandate to plan and implement their plans, and they had the resources to do it unilaterally. And that may have been in large measure because their protected areas were managed as if they were islands, little fiefdoms, little kingdoms, within which they had total control. And indeed, some of those protected areas actually were islands. But now, even though the protected area managers still retain the mandate to plan and implement, they don't have the resources to do it alone, to do it unilaterally. And that's because protected areas are now seen, or not even seen, even more so behave interconnected with so many other elements outside of their protected areas. There's so many things that need outside involvement to get them done. As a matter of fact, the borders around a protected area rarely are respected by anyone. They're not respected by many people, by wildlife, by energy, by politics, by information. There's really very little that boundaries, the political boundaries on paper around protected areas, or even physical boundaries in this particular case, are capable of slowing down or stopping. So if that's the case, then that means that increasingly protected areas need to reach beyond their own boundaries in order to find resources to accomplish their goals. Just a few examples might be having to find a tourism concessionaire to manage their facilities, such as this lodge in Yosemite, or yes, Yosemite. Or maybe community services at the gateway of a protected area. This is Manuel Antonio National Park. You can see the trees rising up in the back in Costa Rica and all the private sector offerings here. They need donations and contributions from tourists, oftentimes for their own projects, whether animal care or conservation. They need the municipality to help provide security or offer permits or contribute equipment to maintain roads and access ways, such as this road that goes into Yellowstone. They need to work with their local communities to protect from their cows going in, right? Those borders that aren't very useful, or poachers, or illegal agriculture, or illegal wood cutting. Enforcement alone doesn't oftentimes result in great improvement in this area, but having relationships with the communities from where those incursionists come from can be much more effective. Protected areas oftentimes have to work with electric utilities because they may want to dam rivers or produce geothermal power within their protected areas. They have to work with schools, both for community support and to justify their education budget. They need to work with civic groups to get volunteers, just to get all kinds of stuff done. And I could give you many more examples of why park managers need to work outside their own boundaries much of the time. Matter of fact, many times these days, park superintendents or administrators or directors, they're oftentimes in offices in larger cities, not in the protected area at all, because they need access to all the other agencies and power brokers and stakeholders that can't be found within their own protected, excuse me. So too often, though, stakeholder community participation is performative or just symbolic. And that oftentimes is because, as I had mentioned in earlier lecture, parks still hold this modernist view, this technical rationality view that if stakeholders aren't technically qualified to make the technical decisions that are needed to manage a protected area, then they shouldn't be given the power to make those decisions. But at the same time, they know that in modern society or postmodern society, talking about participation is very important. So they talk about participation, and they may do symbolic participation, but they don't actually share much power. And just to give you some examples, that if we don't actually qualify how much participation, then saying something is participatory is pretty meaningless. So, heads up, next time you're out there in the field and people start talking about participatory processes, you need to be suspicious. They may use this participatory discourse, saying things such as, and these are at least common phrases in English that might have a red flag or a warning associated with them. They may say, oh, of course, we take local perspectives into consideration. Oh, this was definitely a participatory process. Oh, now we need to get community buy-in. Oh, look at the document. 20 people from the community participated in this workshop. We invited members of the indigenous community. Don't worry, by law, there is a 30-day period in which the public can offer comments on the proposal. Yes, we had several rounds of consultation. So anyway, all of these statements and statements like them can hide the fact that very little power was shared, that the managers or the power brokers themselves didn't want to share power, but they did realize there was social pressure to use the participatory discourse. So, if participation is really power, then what does it mean participatory? Fortunately, this is not either a new question nor a new answer. In 1969, in fact, Sherry Ornstein, a researcher, published an article in the Journal of the American Planning Association, JAPA, introducing the concept of a ladder of citizen participation. This is extremely famous in the literature, and because it does a very effective job at understanding that there are different degrees of participation. Now, in the following slides, I'm going to share some passages that actually come from her article. In the article, for example, she actually shows this. Now, I don't speak a lot of French, but I think this means I participate, you participate, he or she participates, we participate, and they benefit. So what Ornstein says in the article is, there is a critical difference between going through the empty ritual of participation and having the real power needed to affect the outcome of the process. This difference is brilliantly capsulized in a poster painted last spring, that is 1968, by the French students to explain their student worker rebellion. Now, I don't even know what that reference is anymore, but it doesn't matter. The poster highlights the fundamental point that participation without redistribution of power is an empty and frustrating process for the powerless. It allows the power holders to claim that all sides were considered, i.e., the participatory discourse, but it makes it possible for only some of those sides to benefit. It maintains the status quo. So there's the first words from Sherry Ornstein. Now, of course, at the bottom of the chart, there is no participation. And on that, I don't have any particular talk by Sherry, but kind of obvious. At the bottom of the scale, just above none, is the first rung on the ladder, which she calls manipulation. And she says, in the name of citizen participation, people are placed on rubber stamp advisory committees. And for those rubber stamp, if you're not sure of that term, it means it's just a committee that says yes to everything. That's its job. Doesn't actually think or criticize. Rubber stamp advisory committees or advisory boards for the express purpose of educating them or engineering their support. Instead of genuine citizen participation, the bottom rung of the ladder signifies the distortion of participation into a public relations vehicle by power holders. In other words, the people with power are using community members or the powerless to their advantage, perhaps by saying, oh yes, this was a participatory process, or by trying to change their mind about a perspective on a project. Rather than soliciting their opinion, they want to change their mind, to educate them, or somehow manipulate them into giving support. So that's the bottom line. Then the next one up, she calls therapy. And she writes, in some respects, group therapy, masked as citizen participation, should be on the lowest rung of the ladder because it is both dishonest and arrogant. Its administrators, such as mental health experts, from social workers to psychiatrists, assume that powerlessness is synonymous with mental illness. On this assumption, under a masquerade of involving citizens in planning, the experts subject the citizens to clinical group therapy. What makes this form of participation, quote unquote, so invidious or bad is that citizens are engaged in extensive activity, but the focus of it is curing them of their pathology rather than changing the racism or victimization that creates their pathologies. So this too is, in a way, sort of like trying to cure them of their bad ideas or of their powerlessness, so that they conform to the idea, the plan that the power holders have. In other words, it's bad. So next step up, informing. She writes, informing citizens of their rights, responsibilities, and options can be the most important first step toward legitimate citizen participation. However, too frequently the emphasis is placed on a one-way flow of information from the officials to citizens, with no channel provided for feedback and no power for negotiation. Under these conditions, particularly when information is provided at a late stage in planning, people have little opportunity to influence the program designed, quote, for their benefit, unquote. The most frequent tools used for such one-way communication are the news media, pamphlets, posters, and responses to inquiries. So this is one way. It's at least people are being informed, so it's better than nothing, but sometimes it's no better than nothing. Although, when it's combined with higher rungs of participation that we're now going to touch on, it can be a useful way. For example, informing people when the next meeting is, right? Of course, maybe that meeting should have been devised participatively, but perhaps it was. Anyway, moving on to consultation. Ornstein writes, inviting citizens' opinions, like informing them, can be a legitimate step toward their full participation. But if consulting them is not combined with other modes of participation, i.e. higher rungs, this rung of the ladder is still a sham, since it offers no assurance that citizen concerns and ideas will be taken into account. The most frequent methods used for consulting people are attitude surveys, neighborhood meetings, and public hearings. And at least in Spanish, and most likely in English, we hear this term all the time. Oh yeah, it's public consultations. So yeah, people can give us your ideas, but I don't have to listen to your ideas, and I certainly don't have to use them if I don't want, because I have the power and they don't. Next level, placation. It is at this level that citizens begin to have some degree of influence, though tokenism is still apparent. An example of placation strategy is to place a few hand-picked, quote, worthy poor people on boards of community action agencies or on public bodies like the Board of Education, Police Commission, or Housing Authority. If they are not accountable to a constituency, if they don't have to report back to people who elect them in the community, and if that traditional power elite hold the majority of the seats, then the have-nots, that is the poor people, can be easily outvoted and outfoxed, or that is tricked Another example is the Model Cities Advisory and Planning Committee. Model Cities is probably a reference to some example that she uses in the article. They allow citizens to advise or plan ad infinitum. That means they can talk as much as they want, but retain for power holders the right to judge the legitimacy and feasibility of the advice. So it's a lot like consultation. The degree to which citizens are actually placated, and placated means to like make them satisfied, of course, depends largely on two factors: the quality of technical assistance they have in articulating their priorities and the extent to which the community has been organized to press for those priorities. So just taking a relatively poor person with low education and putting them on a committee surrounded by engineers and lawyers means they'll be pretty ineffective. But if that poor person or that community member has the resources, the person or the community they represent, to hire their own lawyers and their own engineers, then in fact, that community person can truly have an influence on that committee, because then they have power and knowledge to participate. And also, if they have a community that behind them that person represents, that community that has voted them in perhaps, then, and that community is organized, then they have political power to apply to this kind of committee. So those are two conditions that are necessary in order for such participation on this kind of advisory body by a community member to actually work. All right, going up another step on the ladder, partnership. At this rung of the ladder, power is in fact redistributed through negotiation between citizens and power holders. They agree to share planning and decision-making responsibilities through such structures as joint policy boards, planning committees, and mechanisms for resolving impasses, saying stalemates or things that they can't work out. After the ground rules have been established through some form of give and take, they are not subject to unilateral change, especially by the power people. Partnerships can work most effectively when there is an organized power base in the community to which the citizen leaders are accountable. As we said before, if that citizen person has a community behind them, then they have the power of that community, if it's organized, to press for its political interests. When the citizens group has the financial resources to pay its leaders reasonable honoraria for their time-consuming efforts, also very important, and when the group has the resources to hire and fire its own technicians, lawyers, and community organizers. Once again, we talked about why that's important. With these ingredients, citizens have some genuine bargaining influence over the outcomes of the plan, as long as both parties find it useful to maintain the partnership. One community leader described it, quote, like coming to a city hall with hat on head instead of hat in hand. In most cases where power has come to be shared, it was taken by the citizens, not given by the city or the stakeholders. There's nothing new about that process, since those who have power normally want to hang on to it. Historically, it has to be wrested or pulled away by the powerless rather than proffered or given by the powerful. So once the community has earned this right to, or taken the right to be in partnership, then there are a few conditions for the partnership to actually work. Now, delegated power. Negotiations between citizens and public officials can also result in citizens achieving dominant decision-making authority over a particular plan or program. Model city, that reference again, policy boards or community action agencies delegate agencies on which citizens have a clear majority of seats, and genuine specified powers are typical examples. I don't think I read that right, though. They delegate a power where citizens have a majority of seats and certain powers. So that's where they control. At this level, the ladder has been scaled to the point where citizens hold the significant cards to assure accountability of the program to them. To resolve differences, power holders need to start the bargaining process rather than respond to pressure from the other end. So in this case, these agencies actually delegate power to organizations or boards that are largely controlled by communities. And if the agencies don't like it, they have to bargain, and they can't just force a change. Now, the highest level, citizen control. Ornstein writes, demands for community-controlled schools, Black control, and neighborhood control are on the increase. So again, this is 1969. Though no one in the nation is absolute control, it is very important that their rhetoric not be confused with intent. People are simply demanding that degree of power or control, which guarantees that participants or residents can govern a program or institution, be in full charge of policy and managerial aspects, and be able to negotiate the conditions under which outsiders may change them. So basically, as the name implies, the citizens are in control of a program, government agency, or something like that. So now looking at them all together, it doesn't really look like a ladder, but if you Google ladder of citizen participation, you'll see lots of examples that look more like ladders. You see the different rungs on the left, and the first three, if you include none, Ornstein considers non-participation. The next three are different degrees of tokenism, or the symbolic levels of participation. And in the top three, the actual are citizen power, or different degrees of citizen power. So now I'm going to quickly show you another way of looking at it, a spectrum of strategies and techniques to involve stakeholders. This is nothing, obviously, to memorize. This is just to give you an idea, once again, how to operationalize these different levels. This is a different author. So public information and education. So this is the informing level of Ornstein. The description, knowledge about a decision, techniques, marketing, press releases, posters, these are all one way. And the message to the public, you want them to know and understand this. Sorry for that bad English. Feedback and information, so this is the consultation level, is to be heard before making a decision. So we use reports, focus groups, and the message is you want them to understand, another spelling mistake, how embarrassing, and support your program. And then consultations, which is probably still part of that same rung, to be heard and involved in the decision. Community meetings, conferences, workshops, you want to understand them and value their points of view and contributions, but you still don't have to use them. So maybe there's a stronger interest in really knowing what they have to say, and you may actually use it. Extensive involvement is the power to influence a decision. So this would be an advisory committee or work groups. But of course, this could be placation too, in which case their role in the advisory committee or their power is not very high. You seriously hope to implement the majority of what they say. So this is actually a strong intent. But still, if you have the power to decide. Co-planning, so agree on a decision, mediation, negotiation. You're completely committed to use the results in almost all cases. So even this language, it still sounds like you, whoever that is, has the power to decide. But point is, you can see the different levels and a little bit more operationalized. And now I will show you the spectrum of public participation, which is a much more modern version of the same idea. This is the product of the International IAP, the International Association of Public Participation. And you can see it's got 5 levels: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower, and increasing impact. I'm not going to read through all of these things because it's the same idea, just a different version of it. So, as you can see, a lot of these are concerned about local control and local empowerment. Indeed, local control is an important principle that we oftentimes hear about in sustainable tourism. And we did talk a little bit about in the week 2 comments. TJ was talking about whether or not taking locals into consideration is essential or not for sustainable tourism. But there is a challenge. And Anna Spenceley, who's a world famous scholar and practitioner in sustainable tourism, talks about the challenge that local control has to achieve it. And that's because local people oftentimes have very little access to markets. So, local people don't have a way to communicate with international markets to bring tourists to their sites, whether because of language or the communication technology. They're not part of the networks that need to be, and their own culture may interfere with that communication. Access to capital, right? If they want to build something, they may have to use community capital. They don't have outside capital necessarily or access to it. They don't necessarily have access to trained personnel, the people they need to operate certain kinds of functions. They don't have access to knowledge capital either, or certainly not enough oftentimes to develop sustainable tourism, local sustainable, community-based, all on their own. Oftentimes they don't understand the business perspective and the realities of operating a business. Oftentimes they don't understand the international or other cultural perspectives beyond their own. If you've ever had the experience of going to a local community and you make some kind of reference to culture and they don't know what you're talking about, or maybe there's a joke among the tourists and the local guides have no idea and they don't laugh. In any event, all of these argue towards having intermediaries between local communities and that access, that capital, that knowledge, that business perspective. And oftentimes these can be local tour operators, national, international tour operators, destination management organizations, even consultants. So there are different kinds of intermediaries to help them access the resources that they need. Weiler and Ham present 4 principles to promote local control, in this case of tour guiding training. Doesn't have to be tour guiding training, but then again, some of their principles kind of depend on it. The initiative for training should come from the host country, and ownership should remain with host country. So the idea is here, if it comes from the outside, it's a project of the outside. When it comes from the outside, it usually means outsiders control the resources, the decisions, the politics, and the objectives, and the locals don't. Training contents and methods should be informed by the literature on what constitutes good or best practice guiding, the adult training literature, trainers' prior experience with appropriate customization to meet local needs. Now, obviously, this is a very training-related principle, but the point here is in developing capacity, actually develop it. Don't just go through the steps that typically benefit the outsiders more than the insiders. It benefits the outsiders because they can put it on their CVs, they get paid good money, great new experiences for them. So all kinds of benefits for the outsiders and maybe little or nothing for the insiders over the medium or long term. Training efforts must be systematically evaluated, and lessons learned from these evaluations must be documented and disseminated widely and used to inform future training efforts. So one way to try to break that monopoly of the outsiders over these kind of trainings is to get real lessons learned and improve them and put those in the hands of locals. Training and supporting in-country trainers is essential for building sustainable human capacity and for ensuring that ecotourism benefits host economies. So this is really trying to put the power of this training program in the local hands and not taking it away when the outsiders leave. So essentially, what we want to promote, forgot to change the title here, so ignore the title. Participatory processes need to set up local ownership. This is to increase the chances of it actually working. Scenarios where real decision-making power is in the hands of locals and not just the participatory discourse or tokenism. Real opportunities to reflect community investment. So the community needs to feel like its investment is truly reflected in the plans and in the products that come out. And their investment comes in the form of time, money, what in English we call sweat equity, like when you're working really hard and you're sweating, so that kind of effort, and opportunity costs. If a community member is helping with this plan, they're not able to do something else. So they have to sacrifice something else to be here. That's an opportunity cost. It's a real cost. The process needs to respect different forms of knowing or knowledge systems. It needs to respect or build dignity of the local people, and needs to help build shared vision between the insiders, the local people, and the outsiders. Here are some principal elements that a truly participatory process working with locals need to focus on. Well, as you all know, I work for a nonprofit called the PUP Global Heritage Consortium, and we have worked with communities and protected area management. And there's a basic thesis that we have, and that is, in order to implement a plan, the stakeholder community needs to develop the social capital, the skills, for example, skills like how to plan, how to resolve conflicts, how to develop consensus. And they need to also develop the motivation to implement these plans. And oftentimes the only opportunity to bring together the stakeholder community that's going to implement a plan is during the planning process itself. So the planning process itself has two principal outcomes. One is it produces a strategic technical document. That's the one that everyone thinks about. But the second one, and perhaps even more important, is the social process of planning needs to develop the stakeholder community capacity to implement that plan and update it. Because if you don't have that community ability, then the plan is useless. Of course, if you have that ability and no plan, obviously you're not going to progress either. So you can see in this thesis, we have a combination of interior and exterior elements that must go together. The plan itself is physical, it's exterior, it's kind of representation of the system, the protected area system, the community. And the interior development of that social capital and those skills and that motivation is extremely important. Remember what Schumacher said, that even if you have lots of resources, they will be left latent unless community has developed sufficient organization, education, and self-discipline or discipline to turn those resources into development. So an important idea about implementation, it's very closely connected to development and power, is that, and this is another idea that comes out of our book, The Future Has Other Plans, that implementation begins long before you even have a plan. And you're like, say that again? All right. Implementation begins even before you have a plan. I know that sounds weird. You're probably thinking, how is it possible to implement a plan if you don't have the plan yet? Well, this is about power. And I'm going to explain how that is. And it's about very early decision, the very first decision in the process to even have a plan. And I like to look at it in terms of path dependence. Imagine you have a ball at the very tippity top of a mountain. Now, while they put the ball on the top of the mountain, with very little energy, that ball could roll down the left side, the right side, front, back. And then once it starts rolling and picking up speed and going farther down the mountain, it's increasingly taking on more and more energy. And it's very, very hard to get the ball back up to the top so that it can roll down a different side. In other words, it starts becoming dependent on the path that it starts rolling down. This is a concept from systems thinking. What do I mean in this case by the mountain and the ball? In this case, that very first few decisions about having a plan, whether it's about working with community or not, is that ball. If you want to do power sharing and participation, that's one side of the mountain. If you want to do it all centrally controlled and using consultants, that's another side. And once that ball starts rolling, it already, in a certain degree, predetermines the outcome, even before you have the plan. I'm going to give you a real example of this, one that I was personally involved in and where I got this lesson from. And this would be in 2016 when my organization won a contract to develop the public use plan for Chagres National Park. This is in Panama. At least at the time, Chagres was the park that generated 40% of the water that went into the Panama Canal. Now, with climate change and passing, I don't know if that number 40% is accurate anymore. On the surface, if you see this picture here, it looks like a pretty participatory process. In fact, in that photo, you have someone representing the Ministry of the Environment. You have the park director in the upper left. You have a couple people representing the Ministry of Tourism, or at least the institute in charge of tourism promotion, and 2 community members. And they're working on a map to do, I don't remember if it was park zoning or what they were doing. It might be zoning. And they're doing it together. Looks great. But we have to roll the clock back a little bit to our first meeting that we had, my folks, with the folks of the Ministry of the Environment, who are the ones paying for this. At that first meeting where we were going to negotiate or look at the terms of reference, they didn't even invite the director, the community, or even the Ministry of Tourism. It was just the Ministry of the Environment and us. And they wanted us to run all the planning sessions, design the planning process, hold the meetings, and write the plan, and then deliver it. And they wanted us to include many different kinds of tools that you're probably all familiar with. They wanted limits of acceptable change, and they wanted carrying capacity, and they wanted zoning, and they wanted VERP, and they wanted this and that. It was like a whole menu of different kinds of tools. I think what they probably did was they took a list, they passed it around their office, and everyone wrote their favorite tool down, and then they gave it to us as the consultants. Now, on one hand, at the beginning, we were kind of excited. Oh, look at all the power we have, right? We can design the process the way we think it should be done. We organize the meetings, and then we write it up. This will be a good plan. Well, once we got going, we started getting to the point we wanted to design participatory plans, the planning meetings with different communities. And I went into the office once with the director, upper left again, and I said, can you come to this meeting, which is really important with the community? And she said, no. I said, why not? I said, because this is your responsibility to run the plan, to run the whole process. I'm very busy. So it turns out that she didn't participate in any of those meetings. And it turns out that almost anyone else felt it was their responsibility to be involved in the writing or to be involved in a lot of the meetings. And it ended up being a very nice product for ourselves, including all the things that they required us to put in there that we wouldn't have included, like carrying capacity. So what was the lesson? What we saw here is in the very beginning, practically at the top of the mountain, that initial meeting, the decision was made that all the power would be with the consultants and the Ministry of the Environment, basically. And the ball began to roll down that side of the mountain. It began to roll down a path that would lead to low levels of participation, or only symbolic participation, as manifested or illustrated by the fact that the director didn't even want to be involved because it wasn't her process. And who can blame her? She wasn't invited to these initial planning meetings about the planning. So in this case, the implementation of that plan, in a sense, happened even before we had the plan. And I don't know what happened to the plan, to be honest with you. I'm sure it wasn't implemented. And that was because there was no support for it. No one felt ownership in that plan. No one saw their sweat equity except for the consultants. And ironically, the consultants, the ones who wrote the plan, are the ones who don't have any power to implement it. And on the other hand, the ones who have power to implement it, should they so be involved, weren't involved in the power and the decision making. So the power was put in the wrong people's hands. That is how implementation begins long before you have a plan. Last, I want to share with you one other case study that I was involved in that kind of brings a lot of these concepts together about community participation, ties them up into one real example. Because in this particular example in Chagres, you didn't really see the community. That was to illustrate that implementation can begin very early with the very first decisions about how power will be distributed. Here, for my master's thesis project, which is 1996, I went to Ecuador. I don't remember how at this point. I think it was through a contact I had with a national NGO called Ecociencia. And we were going to work in Pululahua Geobotanical Reserve in Ecuador. This is very close to Quito, in Mitad del Mundo, if anyone's ever been there. And this is an extinct volcanic crater. And within, on the floor of the crater, is an agricultural community. And this is all a protected area within their national protected area system. Just a tiny bit of history. In the 60s, this was basically a plantation where the plantation owners had almost total power over the workers. It wasn't quite slavery. I think they got paid. They probably could leave. I'm not sure. But the plantation had taskmasters who literally whipped the workers when they weren't working hard enough. So it was a very unequal relationship. And then later in the 60s, maybe what I was describing was the 50s, there was agrarian reform throughout the country where the government took the land away from these plantation owners and distributed it to local communities. So what ended up happening was in this community, you had both properties in the hands of the taskmasters and properties in the hands of those who were whipped, living next to each other, front door to door in this community. Now, because this community, the walls are so steep, the only way to get their agricultural products to market was to go up a very steep road that went up the side, windingly up the side of the crater wall to the top and then to market. And it was very difficult. It is very difficult to have a cow pull a cart up there, especially if you're getting older. And in this community, doctors would only come once a month. They didn't have electricity for a long time because even though it was close to Quito, it was still quite isolated. So that's more or less the historic context. And because of that isolation, this community maintained its aspect, its look of decades ago. It didn't have electricity, it didn't have machinery. And if you look down here, if you can see my mouse, what I'm circling, that was the old hacienda house, where the plantation owners lived, and it's still there. So as cultural heritage. So this community, in a lot of sense, maintained some of that historical cultural heritage, that whole look, that whole feel as if you were there 50, 70, 80 years ago. But because it was so steep and there were no opportunities for jobs, the young people were leaving. And basically the older people were there and they really had difficulty getting their products to market. What they wanted was a good road. They wanted a road that was drilled through the side of the wall of the crater, so it wouldn't be steep, or it certainly wouldn't be that steep. It would be paved and nice. But of course, the government protected area agency called INAFAN would never allow that to happen. It would be a major transformation of the geological structure of the crater. So this nonprofit organization, environmental organization, Ecociencia, had an idea. They said, well, if this community is slowly dying, it's getting older and the kids are leaving, but it still has all of this touristic value, potential agro-touristic value, is there a way we could turn this into an agro-tourism destination, create an alternative form of income so that community members will stay and in exchange for this new source of income, maintain this old historical look? But how would we do that? The community hates the government protected area, a terrible relationship, because the thing they want most, they won't give them. So somehow I found out about this. This is 1996 or 5, I don't remember how. But by my communication with Ecociencia, I agreed to do my master's project to help them build a bridge of communication between the community and INAFAN and Ecociencia to potentially resolve this problem of the road and create some kind of agro-tourism. You can already see this is an idea that comes from the outside. So my proposal was, being a young and ignorant master's student, was to do a participatory rural appraisal methodology. And that's basically based on action research, agricultural action, participatory research. You go through a series of activities and where the community together explores and analyzes its own situation, its own problem, and in a consensus way comes up with its own solution. So anyway, first, before I move on, show you a little bit about the road. This is taken from the road. You see one person didn't even make it up the road apparently, or fell off. And how steep you can kind of infer that it is. And the picture on the left gives you another idea of the steepness and what it takes for the community members to get out of this pit, this trap. Not quite prison, beautiful. It's got great orchid biodiversity, beautiful place. The clouds rolling through, amazing. But that doesn't help them get to market. So I recruited 3 other master's students from 3 other universities. Don't ask me how I did this. In the upper left was a woman studying at the University of Maryland, but she was Panamanian. So she joined the team as part of her master's project. Looking down in the lower right, on the far right side was a Canadian woman from the University of Guelph. And the woman right in the middle with the really red cheeks, she's from the University of Florida. She was American. So it's the 4 of us, and the woman, the short woman, I think was the school teacher, the local school teacher. So, and you see it said 1996, Sondeo Rural Participativo, which is kind of the Spanish version for this. So as I mentioned, we facilitated a series of activities with the community to analyze their own community by making a community map or community transect, analyzing problems, several different activities, 5 or 6 they were. And this picture on the upper left is particularly interesting because the guy on the left was the taskmaster, and the guy on the right was the guy who was whipped by that very taskmaster decades ago. And their houses are only like 50 meters away from each other. So there was an inherent conflict in the community, within the community, because you were either on his side or his side, as well as the overall community conflict with the road or the lack of a road and with the government agency. But nonetheless, we did carry out these activities trying to achieve a certain level of alignment among the community members about what the problem is, what kind of activity, what the purpose of this PRA is, and trying to create a shared vision again of the problem and the solution. And ideally, if you can create that vision of problem and solution, that's motivating and can lead to joint action within the community, or also community with some outside members who are involved in this PRA team or activity. Now, while the activities went well, our biggest problem was neither the government INAFAN nor Ecociencia would send a representative to be part of this team. I think they didn't at this point because they were fearful of the conflict. They didn't want any inflaming of the conflict. But because they didn't send representatives to this, they undermined the entire project, because now nobody was representing their perspective and we had no negotiation power. So when the final meeting came around after having done all the activities, you see our Canadian in the front seat because she didn't speak Spanish, or not much anyway. The community was to tie this all together, to articulate the problem and the solution. And then the community basically said there's only one solution, and that's to build a road through the side of the wall. We could not propose really alternatives because we had no negotiating power. We didn't know what was possible because the government didn't come and Ecociencia didn't come. And because we couldn't speak for them, eventually the community got frustrated and pretty much everyone marched out, and we never actually finished the meeting. While this was a great learning experience about community development and the importance of empowering, the importance of creating shared vision, and many of the lessons I talked about earlier, And of course, this is also a great example of the outsiders benefiting enormously. I benefited enormously in my learning and understanding of participatory processes, community development, working. Didn't mention, but these are indigenous folks as well. Ultimately, we probably did more damage than we did good, which I think is characteristic of a lot of master's, maybe even doctoral projects, because development takes time, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, and there was no time to do this properly. We were there, I think I was there for 6 weeks overall. Development requires building trust, and it was hard to build trust when the two biggest agencies wouldn't sacrifice anything. They wouldn't even show up. And development requires both internal and external development. We certainly had no external resources we could bring to this besides our own bodies. And internal development, while there may have been some shared understanding, it certainly wasn't enough to get beyond the overall problem. To this day, I went back again. This was 1996. I went back in 2004. There was still no tourism product. Now it's 20 years later, and I don't know how it is. I should go back again, I suppose, at some point. With that, there is an article in your reading about Hululawa that I co-wrote with my Panamanian colleague about recruiting a team for PRA. So this will give you a little idea into the technique, the idea of trying to have a multidisciplinary or even an interdisciplinary team, trying to have different voices, different perspectives to overcome bias through triangulation. So that's a really interesting article, and it's short. With that, then, I think we've now talked enough about community development, tourism. Certainly, community development is an important part of sustainable tourism, and thus taking all of these considerations about power and participation are essential if we agree that community is important. So thank you very much. I'll see you very soon on Moodle.